appearing for core participants represented by Oliver Fisher. Yes,
my name is Lindsay Johnson. Together with Jim Shepherd, we're instructed by Oliver Fisher in respect of a number of residents of the tower and the walkway, including disabled residents on the newly refurbished first floor of the tower, who will bring a further dimension, we believe, to the evidence in terms of the concerns over that refurbishment and its relationship to the fire. The advantage of speaking at the end of the day is that you've had the benefit of hearing the submissions made by others. Those comments that we've heard today build on the collaborative approach that there has been between those who act for the core participants and who are survivors of the fire, and we hope to continue that cooperation as matters progress. We welcome the update from Council to the inquiry and the advances which he set out first thing this morning, which address a number of the concerns which we raised in our submissions that were raised more generally. We agree in broad terms with much of what has been said so far today by Council, but in particular we wish to associate ourselves with the comments of Mr Freedman in general and Mr Weatherby on the specific issue of disclosure. We also expressly agree with the points on experts made by Mr Thomas and the need for an expert on property maintenance. But for two short points which have been the subject of Mr Bates' submissions, there would be no need for us to trouble the inquiry with oral submissions at all. But we do so to emphasise two, we would say, related points. First, we agree with the submission of Russell Cook, which was alluded to by Mr Mansfield, that there is a need for an assessor with experience of social housing management, in particular tenant participation in housing management. That is essential as it brings a degree of expertise that is currently lacking. The difficulty perhaps here is that housing is something everyone believes themselves to know something about. We all have some involvement with it, but unfortunately we do not. And we are concerned that that is overlooked, and in our submission the evidence is essential and the assessor is essential to assist the understanding of the inquiry and to enable you to get to the answers you need to get to. The second issue relates to disclosure. Council to the inquiry asked for clarification as to why disclosure of the housing file is important. And Mr Freedman noted that the housing file will address who was in the property and will assist the tribunal inquiry in that regard. Of course, as Mr Bates pointed out, a housing file is much more than that. Council to the inquiry in opening pointed out in the context of expert reports for Phase 1, there is a need to understand the fire safety measures and how they performed. Well, the housing file will contain that information. It will provide any complaint made by tenants as to the issues of disrepair and the functioning of fire safety equipment and what steps were taken to address those concerns. And that's important not just in respect of the tower and the dwellings in the tower itself, but also in relation to the walkway, where there are some concerns and some issues raised in relation to gas safety issues, which it is said by some were ignored, and which you will want to consider when determining the cause of the fire. As noted by many, including Miss Munro today, there are those who believe that the cause of the fire was preventable. The housing file will demonstrate whether there were relevant concerns raised, by whom, and their relevance to the issues raised under Phase 1. And in that sense, such disclosure is tied to effective participation and openness. We'd therefore respectfully submit that disclosure of the individual housing files is essential, and I agree with Mr Bates that it is inconceivable that it would not be. They are the only two issues on which we wish to make submissions.
That's all you'd like to say at this stage? Well, thank you very much indeed. Now, I had some slightly late submissions from Mr Westgate, who is appearing for a Mr Shahid Ahmed. Is Mr Westgate here? Mr Westgate, I'm sorry we had to put you in last, but you probably understand the reason.
Yes, sir. Yes, we do, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to speak. One of the advantages, I suppose, of going last is the more that people say, that the less you have to say at the end. And as Mr Johnson has just pointed out, that is an illustration of how effectively the cooperation between the core participants has operated, and something that we hope will continue. I only want to make 3 points, one about phasing, one about assessors, and one about expert evidence. So far as phasing is concerned, you've heard a great deal of submissions about the appropriateness of maintaining the phasing idea. We've said some things about that in our written submissions, and I don't propose to repeat those. I just want to make a point about the utility of continuing with the phasing idea. In particular, if phasing does continue, it raises a question about the status of findings in Phase 1, particularly if decisions that have been made in that phase, even on a provisional basis, end up being made without full information that then end up being undermined in Phase 2. And that's a very real possibility, particularly as the process of more detailed consideration in Phase 2 may throw up all sorts of things that simply hadn't occurred during Phase 1. That, when the phasing proposal was first put forward, what was a necessary difficulty which would simply have to be worked around because of the urgency that then existed. Of course, that urgency hasn't gone away, and of course there is still a pressing need to reach early and recommendations about safety where necessary. But as the other parties have made clear, there are other ways of addressing that particular problem in the course of the inquiry. The virtue of moving away from phasing is that it does give the opportunity to get on with the thing which is the key concern, which is how could this have happened? And that also has a knock-on point about the involvement of some core participants, because there are some participants who may feel unable or unready to talk about the events of the fire itself, but who may have a great deal to say about the way in which the block was managed before then. And of course, if they have to wait until Phase 2, they have to wait. And those important concerns of theirs are delayed in their resolution and delayed in their having an opportunity to participate in the inquiry. That's all I want to say about phasing. The second point is about assessors, and here I can really follow on from what Mr Bates and Mr Johnson have just said about the importance of having assessor expertise with current practical housing management experience. It's the thrust of a recommendation which I understand is going to be made tomorrow by the FBU as well. And that's something which is of particular interest to those like Mr Ahmed, for who I represent, who was the chairman of the Leaseholders Association, and who can speak to the relationship between him and the TMO and the authority about works and about addressing safety concerns. And it's important that you should have an assessor who is able to evaluate the response to those matters, and will also be able to inform what practical solutions or practical recommendations this inquiry can make in its report. And it also, importantly, goes to the point that was made earlier about the tenants having been systematically overlooked or ignored in the past. And again, an assessor will be able to bring a valuable viewpoint on that. So we support the point made that there should be assessor expertise directed particularly to housing management. And the third point deals with experts. The inquiry, of course, is instructing its own experts, and it's welcome to hear from the counsel to the inquiry this morning that they are sympathetic to the idea of court participants instructing in due course their own experts. Of course, that will be something which will have to be carefully handled and coordinated. But there is, of course, an intermediate stage, because it may well be that the court participants may want to put questions to the inquiry's experts, perhaps in writing, perhaps at a hearing. But in order to do that, they will need to have the assistance of expertise in order to understand the highly technical material that's been put before them, and to formulate appropriate questions. And the only point I make there, and it's not something where we can ask for a particular direction, but it's important that the court participants must be appropriately supported and resourced to be able to make sense of the reports and to comment on them. And as I say, we can't ask for a direction. All we can really ask for is to make the point in advance that we hope for a flexible and realistic approach when requests for assistance are made. Those are the only points I wish to make.
Well, thank you very much.